white people don't give up power easily. We don't.
That's what you've learned in,
We
all the
gain
books you've written.
power easily, or with great determination. But we don't give it up easily.
The Rip Current is about invisible forces that affect us all. The Rip Current in surfing is, an outward flow of water that can carry a surfer or a swimmer to, a place they didn't intend to go. And it's really hard to spot from the beach. And it's even hard to understand what's going on, even when it's got you in its grasp and it's carrying you out. And surfers and swimmers often exhaust themselves trying to fight it. So anyway, the whole point of this podcast and the whole point of the ripcurrent.com is studying, experiencing, discussing, analyzing these invisible forces that have us in their grasp. Venture capital and, the flow of political speech and the ways in which we get gaslit and all of this kind of stuff. And this week, I wanted to do what I consider to be a really fundamental one, which is the weird moment we're in which we seem to be eager to kind of do away with our collective national memory of slavery and the effect that had on the American economy and on our attitudes toward each other and, just the incredibly destructive effects of it. And the fact that people now politically are trying to say, let's just forget all about it. Let's not teach about it in schools. Let's not do any of that. I was thinking to myself, who do I talk to about this stuff? And here's the weird thing, you guys. The best person is my dad. And that's not just because he's my dad. He's an expert in the history of colonialism and slavery. He wrote a bunch of books that I have here on the bookcase in my study that that look into that very thing. And not only that, it comes from a lived experience. He grew up, big chunk of his childhood, in India, and then came home to the United States into the civil rights movement. And so I find his perspective to be really, really fascinating. He's fascinating for all kinds of reasons. He was a stay-at-home dad, and he is someone who's really followed his interests sort of wherever they lead in life. I mean, he's just a really interesting guy, I think, in general. Plus, he happens to be my father. Anyway, I went to his apartment in Oakland. We sat together and did about an hour-long conversation about his life and his work and what he's learned. And I hope you enjoy it, this episode of The Rip Current with my father, the historian Andrew Ward.
I am workshopping a first question, and I don't know what it is yet, and so let's work it out together. The theme of the Rip Current, as you know, is trying to talk about invisible forces that have us in their grasp. My specialty over my career has been things like technology and the way money pollutes innovation and, the invisible ways in which that kind of comes into our lives. I think I learned a lot of that kind of analytical stuff from you. And so the question I think I'm going to be asking various guests, and I'll throw at you, is something like, and maybe there's a more concise version of this, what do you think what is a big overlooked invisible force that's screwing with our lives that you've spent some time thinking about? And how did you first come to recognize that it was there? How did you first come to see it? What do you think? Can we start with that?
Yeah, invisible, first, a lot of my attention has been focused on various bigotries, the effect of bigotry on American life and
Right.
world history. And it's often rendered visible, blatant. It's less visible now than it was.
Right.
Well,
So how did you
it was less
first...
visible during
Yeah.
the Obama administration. It's becoming more visible now.
Sure.
During the Trump administration, it's becoming more accepted because of DEI. But for me, the experience of living overseas in India, having grown up to my 8th year in Chicago, where even though we lived on the south side of Chicago, black people were sort of invisible. And I remember only once sort of noticing that there were black people because I looked down in the backyard and saw that all these domestic workers were climbing the back stairs to their to the houses along the street. And I remember asking my mother about that, and she said, "Oh yes, dear, they just work for us." You know?
And you're like 6 or 7 or something.
Yeah,
at that
something
point.
like that. And but at the same time, my parents were very liberal-minded,
And why was that? Tell us a little bit about that.
well,
Who were they, and why were they so liberal-minded?
well, my father was he was raised in an academic family. These things were abstract, but in the town that he lived in was Oberlin, Ohio, which had a very different racial. The race relations within the town were different, and his father, my grandfather, was very focused on I don't know, in a paternalistic way perhaps, but he found out, for instance, that that there were no barbershops for black people. So he invested in one and set one up, and always went to get his hair cut there. You know, it was sort of old Republican. You know,
I gotta take care of that. I got it. That's okay.
that on the
Yeah.
on the chandelier. Yeah. Sorry about that.
That's okay. That's okay.
Anyway,
So,
so you know, he was sort of a Lincoln Republican. My grandfather was, and my father was just a very reasonable, rational-minded person. And my mother was the daughter of a Presbyterian minister, and she remembers the Ku Klux Klan members in her father's, in this is Butler, Pennsylvania, in her father's congregation, and seeing a cross burning on a hillside in Butler. And she was in rebellion against all of that, including that level of bigotry.
right.
And so there was that in the background, but there wasn't a lot of attention paid to it until we lived on a street, and there was a little storefront, I guess, at the end of the street, and every now and then we'd catch sight of African Americans in sort of African or Middle Eastern gear, walking in and out of this, and it turned out to be, I think, the original headquarters of the Black Muslims,
Oh, interesting. Huh.
who in turn, by the time I returned to Chicago in 1966, that whole neighborhood had become a Black Muslim.
Farrakhan and the whole thing.
Yeah, the whole shebang.
Wow. So you moved. Let me lead you a little
Yeah.
bit. You moved to India.
Right. 1954.
You're 8 years old.
Right.
And what was the impetus for that? Why?
My father became a Ford Foundation representative, and his job was to be a consultant with the government of India, which was new, 7 years old by that point,
Because they had just gotten free of the British.
on education. Yeah, that's right.
And the way I have described it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, is that he was sent over there essentially to, in a sense, the Ford Foundation was kind of a way of trying to keep India from turning communist, was one sort of subtext of the mission. And Grandpa showed up, right, and immediately realized that that place was so much more complicated than he expected,
Well-
and that turning them into an American-style education system was not
Not going to happen.
Not gonna happen.
Although I wish he were still alive today to see that some of the technical institutes that he helped to design and found to replace what the British had left behind, where they were studying Greek mythology. This is a country, that had its own mythology.
right. They didn't need
That went
this newfangled
went
white
back
person
further
mythology.
back
Yeah,
than
exactly.
mythology.
Yeah, right.
But an example of that is also my mother understood this too. This was during the time of the McCarthy stuff, the Red Scare, and so we were, a little bit out on a limb out there, but at least with out of range of HUAC. My father had never been a communist, anything but a communist. He's a rather conservative Democrat, but nevertheless, at one point, some Ford company, motor company people came to visit, and at dinner, and they asked and one of them turned to Humayun Kabir, who was a big deal in the educational ministry
Yeah.
in Delhi, and said, "How many communists do you have working for you?" And Humayun Kabir is a lovely little man. Bengali said, he didn't know what to say. And my mother leaned in and said, "I think Mr. Kabir is much too polite to say that's none of your business." That
Right.
kind of thing.
Right.
So they were a force. My parents were a force. My father refused to do anything in that job until he'd had a year in India. Usually people come and they got all hot stuff ideas.
I talk to people right now in tech, right, who launch they have 9 months to go from even having the concept to launching a product. And when I talk to people who actually work in products of any kind, they say that they get maybe 2 or 3 weeks. Before they've got to demonstrate a result immediately, which is why we have this kind of live experimentation going on in tech right now. But Grandpa sends a telegram home saying, "I'm going to need a year.
I'm going to need a year to get the lay of the land here." And so all of his best confidants were all Indian, very well educated. A lot of them gone through the British system as well as Indian. So for us, we were experiencing people, of color, being people of power ourselves, people of color running things with, and having authority and having competence and having unbelievably brilliant ideas about things. And for somebody at, age 8, my sister was 6, my brother was 13. It was a revelation.
So how did that manifest itself? So I'm trying to imagine like you guys sitting at the dinner table. Your dad has come home from one of his many listening trips,
right?
And he's talking about it. Like, what was the?
Or he's got his pals visiting for a meal, that sort of thing. We got to know these people, Sayedin and Humayun Kabir, and people came from the ministry. And then there was nobody more, effective and charismatic than Jawaharlal Nehru, who was prime minister. And you just, everybody bowed down before him, black and white.
So there's just sort of a clear. Was it just sort of meritocratic? You're seeing just like, well, the very smartest people have risen to the top, and it doesn't matter what background they're from, or are you in some way recognizing that they have to be
the extent to which we understood the lay of the land.
Right.
There may have been all kinds of other factors about caste and religion and all the rest of it, but Kabir, for instance, and the head of the Ministry of Education were both Muslims who refused to go along with the Pakistan.
With partition.
Yeah, with partition. But it also, the other thing that we encountered, we had, ridiculous as it seems, we had servants.
Sure.
And they were Indian, and they were, and we had, very serious kind of relationships. We knew them, and we visited their families in the back, and all, it sounds absurd.
Right, it's a weird relationship, but it's a kind of intimate relationship.
Yeah. But in any case, we were the minority, and we were in many situations at a disadvantage. Didn't know the language, didn't know the lay of the land.
And why do you think? Let me ask you, why do you think Grandpa and Grandma, and how did they pass on to you this attitude of this place is extremely complex? We are kind of socially and culturally irrelevant here, and that's okay. And if anything, that's kind of cool. Is sort of how it feels to me. They were communicating. Like, how do you think?
Well,
that
I think it was also kind of for both of them. They both knew how smart they were, so they weren't threatened by this at all.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, my mother had come out of this, parsonage, life.
Escaped this very repressed childhood.
Yeah, and was very brilliant, from the beginning.
Sure.
And my father too, Neither of them were religious. Neither of them were terribly, yeah. Had they been deeply religious and gone to church every Sunday, that might have been different. That
Right, because
might
they'd be maybe a little more dogmatic
Yeah.
about how things are supposed to be.
Yeah, yeah, they might have been, but being agnostics, they were able to, I think, accept these other norms. My mother, I remember my mother telling me that one of the moments she broke with Christianity was she was a child, and it was when she got the notion from some preacher's sermon that babies born out of Christianity, children born out of Christianity, were going to hell. And my mother was absolutely outraged. And from then on, she just dug her heels.
Clearly, these people don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah, it was just, it's just crazy.
Right.
And so that kind of divisive exclusivity of religion was something that she was really fought against. My father had the same instinct, but it was more abstract in this case. He never had to live in that kind of repressive atmosphere.
Right. So for you, so 8 years old, that's a really formative time. You're trying to figure
Right.
out your relationship to other people. You're learning how to even have friends and that kind of stuff.
And I had convinced my sister, who was 6, that we were moving to Indiana.
Yeah. Sorry, Ellen. Do you think that that formative period where you are in this very comfortable place, I mean, obviously,
Loved it.
right? You're having a great time, servants, and you're summering in Kashmir, and you're doing all this cool stuff. So you're not in any way economically insecure, and your sort of status isn't really in question. But at the same time, or maybe as a result, you're able to kind of see this landscape as separate from you, and that's fine.
Yeah.
That's no problem.
Yeah, and color just didn't matter. It just didn't matter. It was just, it just, all of that stuff was relaxed, felt at the time.
Yeah.
Sort of relaxed. And the way life, the world should work.